Hi, everybody. Glad to see you. We are just working a little bit here to present the Wellbeing curriculum that's going to be part of our class. And this recording is really there to help contextualize this curriculum, why we're doing this work, what goals we have, and so forth. And in this presentation, I'm just going to give a little context for that. Um, but I'm going to start by saying that the primary goals that we have for this, the kind of major overarching goals, even though there are many, are to increase awareness about how one can cultivate well-being. And that's essentially an informational goal where you're learning information. And the other goal is really fostering well-being, which is more of an experiential goal. And this is something that may be missing in many curricula these days. So the one thing motivating primarily the development of this curriculum for me is that we at UCI have signed on to what it is the Okanagan Charter. And as you see, that's the International Charter for Health Promoting Universities and Colleges. And UCI signed onto this charter in 2021. And there are a number of committees across campus that work on the implementation of this charter. And those efforts are called the Comprehensive Wellbeing Initiative. I have some links on the slide for you. And in any case, I sit on one of those committees that focus on campus culture. And I look particularly at questions of classroom culture. So my own background is in pedagogy, and that is the study of teaching and learning. And I'm also in the School of Humanities, which means that the questions that I usually ask about teaching and learning are questions that relate to what it means to be human. And as I hope you'll see, the well-being curriculum that we're looking at really brings all of those interests together and all of those motivations. So the Okanagan Charter, I want to offer a sense of what that charter is about and how it defines well-being. As a health promoting university, the Okanagan Charter states that universities and colleges infuse health into everyday operations, business practices, and academic mandates. By doing so, health promoting universities and colleges enhance the success of our institutions, create campus cultures of compassion, well-being, equity, and social justice, improve the health of the people who live, learn, work, play, and love on our campuses, and strengthen the ecological, social, and economic sustainability of our communities and wider society. And I think it's important to see that because we get a sense from that framing that there's in fact a very large, a very broad purpose and a very broad understanding of well-being that is not only individual but collective and environmental. And so we want to have a sense of what that kind of work would then mean. The Okanagan Charter focuses more on well-being as a salutogenic approach. And what that means essentially is that the charter is imagining health as something that needs to be understood as well-being, not as something that needs to be understood through pathology. So it's a very proactive approach to well-being. And really what it's imagining well-being as is as a process or as a kind of continuum, and therefore it's not an end. Rather, well-being is sort of continually happening and in play. And it also views well-being holistically as a kind of emergent, a kind of integrative process that is integrating all those things that we saw in the last slide, the collective, the individual, the environmental, etc. So we have this notion of what is being presented as a model of well-being, and then we have all these folks on campus who are working, on trying to integrate some of these approaches on campus. But the real question is, how does this relate to doing things in the classroom around well-being? And why does this relate to classrooms at all? Why do we have to think about this? And I think very simply put, that's just because we're facing real mental health challenges right now. We are in a mental health crisis. And just to give you a sense of just a brief sense of some of the statistics of the American College Health Association's recent survey that surveys the mental health challenges for undergraduates in our nation. If you look at some of the statistics, they're quite alarming. We have a 35.8% rate of folks who note that depression negatively impacts their academic performance, a 37.1% stating that anxiety impacts their academic performance, 77.6 stating that they have moderate or high stress, and 51.2 reporting that that amount of stress and the quality of that stress negatively impacts their academic performance. 20.7 show serious psychological distress. And for gender nonconforming students, it's much higher, 39.1%. 49.3% of our undergraduate students say they are lonely and that seriously affects them. And 26.6 are screened as positive for suicide risk. Those are pretty alarming numbers collectively. And what's happening then at the same time that these kinds of things are happening to our students is that there's a real, of course, impact on the services, on mental health services. So at the same time, that all that's happening, the American Psychological Association pulse survey, the most recent pulse survey that came out, shows us that one half of psychologists have now no new openings and have considerably longer wait lists. More than 1/3 of psychologists are burned out. That psychologists report that there is an increase in the severity of their patients' symptoms, and that the time in which they have to treat patients is growing longer. So in short, there's really, there just aren't enough psychologists to support the need. And we then therefore need to be thinking about ways in which we can cultivate well-being in other contexts and relieve this pressure to some extent, and which we can find ways to be resilient for ourselves and to build up that kind of resilience and well-being for ourselves. And the classroom plays a really important role there. And so I think it's important for us to be thinking about how the classroom, though traditionally conceived of as being very disconnected from personal life or from love or from play, as the Okanagan Charter states, that we have to see those things as being totally interconnected. And that's primarily because when we are not feeling mentally well, we simply are not learning well. So mental health simply facilitates learning. And if we want to teach and we want to learn as best we can, we have to really make efforts to cultivate well-being. Here I show a number of different studies that indicates the way in which depression, anxiety, poor sleep quality, chronic stress, trauma, and so forth really affect learning in a number of different ways, not only executive function, memory, and attention, but a whole array of academic activities. So this is not something that is outside of the realm of teaching and learning. And one of the real questions that, comes up when we're thinking about our situation that we're in right now is really why this is happening. Is this because of, the various crises that are happening, across the world? There are many. There's now a term that articulates this layered sense of crisis called the polycrisis, in which we have one after another emerging. Or is it something that's more internal to us? And there are a lot of different things that we can talk about, and in my classes, we will certainly be talking about the different things that affect us in this way. But I think it important to mention here this notion that Christine Rosen brings up about what she calls the extinction of experience. So she's really interested in sort of identifying these problems as an internal problem. And what she writes about is that we are, she says, witnessing the extinction of human experience in which more and more we relate to our world through information, excuse me about the typo, through information about it rather than direct experience with it. And what Rosen is really articulating here is that she's really kind of looking at technology and the way technology affects our relationship to the world and our relationship to experience itself. And she argues that technology teaches us to mute our experience, to repress our body's signals of basic needs like hunger or sleep, our need for face-to-face communication, the practice of doing things with our hands, and the non-quantifiable experience of unmediated pleasure. And as Rosen sees it, this is actually causing an existential crisis that really that make the aspects that define us as human really kind of vulnerable. What she's really arguing is that the way technology is shaping our experience means that we're essentially losing the neurobiological foundation that tells us what we need to survive, that tells us what counts as reality. And that's in part because we are constantly having our attention directed and micromanaged in various ways. And I think that most people can probably, in the audience, can probably identify with this. I think that all of us have had that experience in which we're over-mediated and we kind of feel that vague fuzziness, and we even feel how that over-mediation can really contribute to stress, and we have all this information accumulating. It can make you feel a little bit murky, and really. And that feeling that we have in our bodies when that's happening is described as a kind of overwhelm or an overload of cognitive load. So I'm just going to talk really shortly about probably a couple things that you've already heard about, but I'm trying to articulate why it is that we want to think about well-being again in classrooms and what's happening to us in our culture, what's happening to us in our ways of experiencing the world, that we can really recast, rethink a little bit here. So as Rosen is talking about this extinction of experience, and she's really talking about how we're not out there in the world, we're not talking to people, we're not engaging with the world directly, rather we're always mediating. And because we're always mediating, and we have phones right in front of our face all the time, we are taking in all kinds of information, constantly taking in information. And what that's doing is increasing our cognitive load, which is essentially the amount of information that working memory is able to, can hold at one time. And so we have to think about it in these terms, so that if we're taking in information, it's kind of like a dam, it's like a reservoir, and it's like the water that fills the reservoir, and it fills and fills and fills and fills. And at a certain point, some of that water has to be drawn down or released, okay, so that the dam doesn't overflow, right? So there's a kind of balance that needs to be found. And that slow release of the water, that we can kind of associate symbolically with what is the processing of information. So what we need to do is we need to find this equilibrium that keeps us kind of in between states, that we're not just taking in information, but we're also processing what we take in. And when we do that sufficiently, then we live essentially in what Dan Siegel calls the window of tolerance. And I'm guessing that many of you have heard about this window of tolerance. And so here we have this diagram of the window of tolerance, and it's essentially kind of a space in which we're maintaining an optimal arousal level. So when we're kind of aroused just the right amount, we find that balance, we learn effectively, we engage meaningfully with our friends, we complete tasks efficiently, we regulate our emotions properly, we're really sort of our actions are guided by the sort of working of our prefrontal cortex. And when a significant stressor appears, then as we see here, we might sort of slip out of the window of tolerance, and we can enter a state of hyperarousal or hypervigilance. And so that kind of state it resembles a little bit an animal's response when it's approached by a predator. It's a real, reactive response where the animal is totally focused on the threat. It has elevated blood pressure, it has increased heart rate, but it's just totally alert and focused on that particular threat. And usually what happens is that when that danger passes, then these stress symptoms subside, right? And we go back, you'll excuse me there, then we go back into that window of tolerance again. And our nervous system basically returns to a kind of baseline. This is not true for everyone. We know that people who have experienced trauma, for example, don't find that kind of regulation happening for them. And they can have, for that reason, a much more difficult time engaging in daily tasks or in learning. But the point that I want to make here actually is not about those folks. It's more about our present culture, which places us in a state of hyperarousal consistently often. We've got 24-hour news cycles, we've got constant notifications going off. And what's happening is that we're essentially being placed in a state of persistent alarm, and that is actually leading folks to chronic stress. So folks are continuously releasing hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, and they do not have enough rest in between. And so this hyperarousal or hypervigilance, essentially, that lasts for quite a long time. There isn't a return to the optimal arousal state as it should. And just to be clear, we can also sometimes, when we have a great deal of stress, enter into hypoarousal, which is kind of the inverse. And that, instead of being a kind of fight or flight response, is more of a freeze and a shutdown response, in which everything closes down, in which we withdraw, we disengage, we procrastinate, can't get our homework done, or really just commit to our routines to the exclusion of everything else. So I hope everybody can see through these kinds of metaphors of the dam and through the metaphor of the window of tolerance that what we're really experiencing in our present culture is a culture that does not allow for equilibrium, that in fact tries to get people hyper aroused, because in that way it can manage people. And so we're dealing with the consequences of that in many ways. And let's see, I'm going to skip a couple of things here. So there's another thing that I wanted to bring to everybody's attention, which is that all of us do the work of taking in a lot of information, and all of us do the work of mediation in some ways. But what we've learned is that if we don't take enough time to actually do the processing of that, we do get stressed out. And this is in part due to the fact that we are not activating the networks of the brain that in fact do the processing. So recently there have been discoveries about a brain network that's called the default mode network. And it's really helped us understand the stakes of this. And on the one hand, we know very, very little about it because it's very recently been discovered, only in the last 20 years or so. But it helps us understand essentially how it is that overwhelm can happen to so many people in a culture in which technology is driving their experience. So the default mode network was unexpectedly discovered in the 90s, and it essentially consists of brain areas that are associated with resting states. So what happens essentially is that when you go into a moment where you're doing nothing, where you're just daydreaming and looking outside and not particularly doing anything task driven, this network fires up and works hard. And essentially what this network is doing is that it is processing and constellating our experience. So it's associated with a whole number of different brain activities that are crucial. These include self-referential thinking, which are essentially, mental processes that are involved when we reflect on ourselves and on our own traits and experiences. It affects social cognition or theory of mind, which is the ability to understand or to reason about others' mental states, which essentially is crucial for social interaction and communication. It helps the function of episodic memory, which is the capacity to tell like when things happen in time and place, and therefore helps with autobiographical memory recall. And autobiographical memory recall isn't just about remembering facts, but also kind of as connecting, the facts of a particular memory with the emotions of a particular memory and being able to kind of experience those past experiences for ourselves. Autobiographical memory also is really important to create that coherent narrative of the self. It's the key component of what's called the epistemic self. And that self is sort of the self that understands one's life, one's values, one's belief, one's principles all at once. Um, It helps with a number of other things, including language processing and semantic memory. But I think the important thing to note is that our very sense of self, the very sense of who we are as an individual, and therefore how we relate to other people, is largely dependent upon default mode network activity, which means that if the default mode network is not firing up, we have an increasingly sort of alienated, dissociated sense of self. We can't bring all of the experiences of our lives together into a coherent narrative or whole. And that leads to all kinds of mental health disorders, all kinds of neurological and psychiatric disorders, from spectrum disorders, dissociative disorders, depression, anxiety, Alzheimer's, and more. So this is directly related, this fact that we're not able to process our experience, that we're not able to process information, that we're not experiencing, but rather that we're just taking in information. This is causing massive health problems across the board. So the question is then, okay, great, this exists. So hopefully I'll daydream a little bit more these days. It's going to be really important to do. But also, we can shift culture in different ways to make us more connected to experience and to help us do the work of this kind of processing. And even though traditionally the classroom is a space in which, we're prioritizing the collection of information, we can conceive of it as a space that also can do the work of experiencing itself, that also can do the work of this kind of integration and processing. In short, what we need to do in our culture at this point is that we have to learn differently. We don't maybe need to change the culture of every classroom, but we do need to learn other modes of learning because we are losing this very essential part of our human nature. And then the question, of course, is, okay, great. Let's say we do change some things. Well, what do we do? What classroom practices are actually going to help mitigate these issues? How are we going to have pedagogies that can actually further this Okanagan Charter's notion of well-being? How can we ensure that we are attending to each individual's well-being as well as the collective? How can we ensure that we're incorporating, experiential learning and processing into the equation? And that gets even more complicated when we consider that well-being actually differs for each individual. The Okanagan Charter defines well-being as something that is constantly shifting and changing, and for which every individual has essentially a kind of a different take, a different equilibrium, a different balance, a different way in. So how do we ensure that we can develop a curriculum that isn't standardized? Because standardization is not going to be effective in this context. And that's essentially what we're doing here. We're trying to engage in something that actually allows for both individual and collective sort of generation or cultivation of well-being. So that's our curriculum. And what's basically happening in your well-being curriculum is this. On my website, which is noted here on the bottom, on the mindfulness and well-being page, there are a bunch of buttons that you can, look at and browse through that have a whole number of different evidence-based well-being practices that are drawn from positive psychology and contemplative pedagogy and more. Okay? So these are all evidence-based practices. A lot of studies have been done on these things. And what will happen is over the quarter that you will try out some of these practices. And you'll be doing so outside of class. We'll be doing some things inside of class too, but we'll be doing them outside of class. And the idea here is that outside of class, you try at least 2 of these practices a week, and some of them are a little bit longer and some of them are extremely short, but you try at least 2 a week. Most students end up doing a little bit more than that, but the bar is set pretty low. And over the course of the quarter, you try at least 3 practices over the course of the quarter. So you might try one practice for the first 5 weeks, and then try one practice for a week, and then try another for the rest of the quarter. The other suggestion is that you try at least 2 practices that are new. So if it happens that you do a lot of yoga, or if it happens that you work out a lot or go running a lot, or maybe you're a meditator, maybe you're more than welcome to use that as one of those activities as one of your practices. But the encouragement is actually to try something new and to be open to new things and to see how they work. Experience is the idea, experiential learning. And the other hope here is that we try each of these practices more than once. It may be that you try a practice and you really just think, yeah, this is kind of boring. It's not for me. Well, just give it one more try. Just give it one more try to see how it goes and see if anything changes. If you still don't like it, that's no problem. And essentially what you do then is you keep a log of your practice. As you're doing the practices, there's a little log that I'll show you very shortly on my website. And that log will help you see or help you see or remember how you were experiencing a practice, at the beginning, middle, and end of the quarter. And then at the end of the quarter, you write a 2-page reflection about your experiences. There's a specific prompt that asks you specifically about how your understanding of well-being changed, if at all, what it is now, like what do you think well-being is? How do you define it? What you think the role of well-being in education is, how your experiences affected you, and so forth. And the log itself and the 2-page reflection, those together are worth 10% of your grade in the seminar that I'm teaching now. In other classes or it may be a little bit different. I'll let you know. Okay, so we will quickly turn to my okay. So here we are at the website. And you'll see on our mindfulness and well-being page that if you just scroll down here a little bit, there's a little bit of a um, articulation of why we do these things here. And then you'll notice that right underneath that, there's a link here to the mindfulness and well-being log. So you can go ahead and click on that log, and you'll see that there is this well-being practice log here and a couple of examples of how that practice log can look. So you're welcome, if you'd like, to either just use this as a template or to print it out if you like. You're also welcome if you'd like simply to use a journal to write this login. It doesn't need to be anything specific. You just make it as convenient as possible for yourself. So that's the log. That's where you keep some kind of note of your practices. And then you can look under these buttons here for particular practices that may interest you. So for example, if you want to try out meditation, you can try it out on, something like Calm app or Insight Timer or Headspace if you want. Or there are also a couple of meditations that I've recorded for you in case you prefer just to use those as well. You can try out creativity practices. There are some things having to do with nature, or mandala projects, or drawing of music, something like that. You can use practices that have to do with compassion and gratitude and positivity. We have a lot of nature practices that a lot of students really like quite a bit. Contemplative listening practices and journaling practices. So there's a lot of journaling that we're going to do in our class, but you can also be doing journaling at home. And if you look at the journaling prompts here and you click on the different topics, you'll see that if you click on one of these buttons, that there are a number of different journaling prompts that you could potentially use if you're interested. So there's a lot of material there. It's for you to just go explore to see what you think is interesting. I'll also be updating these things with different kinds of practices along the way. So please keep looking back. And if you find practices also that are of greater interest to you, maybe, working out at the gym and running and so forth, those are also included as practices. So that's no problem. I haven't included them here because I think they're more mainstream and most people associate those already with health and well-being. But you're more than welcome to use those practices. And I would just encourage you to try again some things that are new to you. And I will touch base throughout the quarter to see how everything's going. And it's really interesting as you move along to even watch and see how your log shifts and changes over time to see if there's any kind of change there and if you've learned anything about yourself and developed some kind of awareness or insight into the person you are and what works for you. So I am very excited for you. I hope you enjoy the process. I can tell you this, that the degree to which you enjoy it, can be more or less. There will be some folks who really love this process. There are some folks who may not really love the process all that much. And you know what? That's okay, actually. This is an educational thing. So I think that I'd encourage those of you who may not be terribly interested simply to, treat this as just education, learning about the things that you may need one day, or learning about things that you can use to help other people in your life. There might even be folks who, if you've gone through a kind of difficult time and you feel as if your mental health is not ideal right now, I'd really encourage you to reach out to me because I can suggest certain kinds of practices, or to your teacher if you're in another class. Your teacher can suggest practices that are potentially better for you than others. Uh, but I just want everybody to know that this is an individual process, that you try something out. If you feel like it's really something that's in fact harming your experience, you simply stop. That's as simple as it gets. You just stop and you move on to something different that's actually going to be supportive. And that's not to say that you just drop something if it's boring. If something's boring, you might even just give it an extra try here or there to see if anything changes. But, this is about kind of finding a balance here again, finding an equilibrium between what may be boring may not feel great, may feel it's somewhat awkward or strange or not particularly uh, uh, isn't doesn't contribute very much to your joy immediately, and then something that's actually like kind of harmful to you. And so what we want you to do is just kind of rethink this notion of well-being a little bit as you're practicing these things, and keep in mind that well-being, it really isn't always just about feeling good. It isn't always about just feeling pleasure. Sometimes we do things for ourselves that contribute to our well-being that may not be super pleasurable right away. And what we're doing is we're kind of engaging that. We're feeling a little tolerance for that. We're exploring that, and we're just being curious about, yeah, what exactly am I feeling about this particular experience right now? That's what we're after. So I encourage you to be curious and to explore, try to have patience, and also do what's good for you. You know best.